Welcome again, everybody. This is the TUMIVolt Charging Station. My name is Lina. I work for the TUMI team at GIZ, and this is the first of our webinar series, which we'll be holding regularly from now on, and which is called the TUMIVolt Charging Station, with various topics focusing on e-mobility. And we thought that it makes a lot of sense to start off this discussion right where e-mobility starts. So this very first session that we're holding today will focus exclusively on raw materials. We'll be looking at the environmental and the social aspects of raw material sourcing, and we'll look at different aspects in relation to delivery chains for battery. Let me just navigate the screen. All right. This is just a broader overview of what we'll be doing today. But in order to start off this discussion, I'd like to introduce you to the expert speakers that we have on board today. I've quickly introduced myself and my colleague Marvin, who's also on board for the webinar today. We will be moderating the topics for you. And also with us today is Johannes Lohmeyer, who is an advisor at the GIZ sector program Extractives for Development. Johannes is a specialist on battery minerals and climate sensible mining. And he's also working on the transparency initiative in the extractive sector, which is called EITI. And he has a large focus on the role of China in the mining sector. Joining him from the same program at GIZ is Lisa Stellner. She's responsible for the strategic communication of the program. She also supports the work on environmental and climate issues in the sector. And very importantly, she's the contact person for the cross-cutting theme of gender equality in the mining industry. So we've got two great experts from GIZ who will be walking you through some of the facts and myths of raw material sourcing. And then we have another colleague on board, which is Dr. Philipp Schütte. He's a geologist at the BGR. He's been there since 2010, and he started working based out of Rwanda and Burundi, where he managed a technical cooperation project on mineral certification, traceability, and due diligence. So he has a lot of experience on the ground, really working in the countries where raw materials come from. And since 2015, he's now working out of the BGR headquarters in Hanover in Germany, and he's focusing on mining and sustainability research. So currently he's responsible for the technical coordination of a German-Congolese cooperation project on conflict minerals and copper-cobalt sector. So he will be giving us a more deep look into the situation in the Congo, and he will be looking into this case study later on during the webinar. So before I hand over to our expert speakers, just some technical information before we kick off. Can I ask everyone who's not speaking, please, to make sure that they are muted so that our speakers can talk and present uninterrupted. There is a chat function in this webinar, which by clicking on and sending a message to all or just to the organizers, you're able to ask questions throughout the webinar. Please make sure that you indicate who you're addressing your question to, and then my colleague Marvin will be collecting all the questions, and he will be handing them over during the Q&A session to the individual speakers and making sure that all questions are being answered. If we do, however, not manage to answer all questions, we'll make sure to have a follow-up email to you, and we will go back and forth with the expert speakers and make sure that you get an answer to the question you're looking or what's interesting you the most. Finally, please, at the end of the webinar, we have a very short survey. It's only 5 questions, I believe, but it's going to help us a lot in terms of improving our webinar service to you. So please feel free to share all your impressions and experience from this webinar with us. We're very interested also in the question of what other topics are you interested in the area of e-mobility, because as I said, there's going to be a lot of more webinars on the issue, and we're always happy, of course, to incorporate input from people interested in the sector. Lastly, I'm sure you're all aware that right now online services are booming, so there's a lot of demand on GoToWebinar everywhere in this world. So if there's any technical problems, I apologize in advance, and I'll ask you to please bear with us. So without further ado, let me hand over to my colleague Johannes, who will be walking you through mineral sourcing for electric vehicle batteries.
Thank you very much, Lina, for the kind introduction. Yeah, it's a great honor to be speaking with all of you today. My name is Johannes Lohmeier, and together with my colleague Lisa Sterner, we will give you a brief overview about the minerals which are part of the electric vehicle battery. Next slide, please. Thanks. First, we want to give you an overview about the minerals contained in a battery, and this includes also the major producer countries of battery materials. And we will also show that the mining of minerals is associated with opportunities and risks along the value chain. And we'll briefly present you some of the international initiatives and standards that promote responsible supply chains. And finally, we will come to some secondary mineral supply, for example, through recycling. But now let's get started. Lisa.
Thank you, Johannes, and also from my side, thanks to the TUMIVolt team for having us at their first webinar. As Lena said, my name is Lisa. I work for GIZ's program Extractives and Development, and I will give you a quick introduction on the minerals that are inside such e-batteries and where they come from. So let's get finally started. As you can see, the basis of all modern batteries are mineral raw materials such as lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and graphite. In e-mobility, two types of batteries have become established due to this day, which differ mainly in the composition of the cathodes. These two are the nickel cobalt aluminium battery and the one that you can see on our slide here, the nickel manganese cobalt NMC battery, on which we are going to focus today. So in general, the leading NMC battery contains 11 kilograms of manganese, 4.5 kilograms of lithium, and 12 kilograms of both cobalt and nickel. Next slide, please. So by 2030, the German government wants 6 million e-cars to be driven in the country. And of course, Germany is not the only country with such targets. So therefore, a lot more minerals will be needed. On this slide, you can see the future mineral demand for our electric vehicle batteries in 2035. So meaning, for example, the amount of nickel needed will increase by 476% compared to the amount of 2016. And if you look at lithium, for example, the estimates are even more extreme. So the amount of needed lithium will increase by more than 600% compared to the numbers of 2016. And just a note here to the slide, the statistics only calculates for electric vehicle batteries. So the hybrid electric vehicles and the plug-in hybrid electric vehicles are not included. And also, as I said at the beginning, we are only talking about this specific kind of battery, the nickel manganese cobalt battery. Okay, so let's have a closer look on where the minerals come from, starting with lithium. The top producing countries for lithium are Australia with 61%, Chile with 17%, China with 8%, and Argentina with 6% of the world global production. So also Bolivia has very large deposits, but they are just starting to mine them. So that's why they're not on the slide. The economically most important deposits of lithium are solid rock deposits, mainly in Australia, and the salars, mainly in Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, and China. Next slide, please. So today, already 65% of the worldwide produced lithium is used for only battery manufacturing. And as I said before, about half of the world's production comes from the salt lakes, the so-called salars, which are located in the Andes region of Latin America. I think the Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia might be the most famous one and is also considered as the world's largest lithium deposit. The high Andean region of the salt lakes are one of the driest areas on Earth, and unfortunately, the extraction of lithium is extremely water intensive. So as you might have already seen in one of the effects, to produce the lithium for just one electric car battery, about 80,000 liters of water are needed. This corresponds to the capacity of 400 bath tubes of 200 liters each. So what about cobalt? The top producing country for cobalt is the Democratic Republic of Congo, with more than 60% of the world's production. Afterwards comes Russia, Australia, the Philippines, and Canada. Next slide, please. The European Union classifies cobalt as a critical raw material for being an essential industrial material and also for being produced mainly in the DRC. It is moreover estimated that 10 to 30% of DRC's cobalt production comes from artisanal and small-scale mining. As artisanal mines are usually informal, that means that the already poor labor and safety regulations cannot be controlled effectively. But I do not want to talk too much about cobalt or the DRC because we are going to have another input from our colleague from the BGR on that later. So let's move on to nickel. The top nickel producing countries are Indonesia, the Philippines, and Australia. And 60% of the nickel production is located in Asia. So next slide, please. Much of the nickel mining takes place in countries where the already critical mining process is not effectively controlled, as in the DRC, for example. And this means that, for example, in Indonesia, the nickel mining is in territorial conflict with the tropical rainforest. Also, regions characterized by nickel mining are often considered critically contaminated. Among other things, heavy metal pollution of the environment and acid rain can occur close to nickel mines. So last but not least, manganese. The world's top producing countries of manganese are South Africa with 31%, Australia with 18%, Gabon with 12%, and Ghana and Brazil with both 7% of the global production. Next, when it comes to manganese, China dominates the market. It refines and processes 67% of all global mined manganese ores. Moreover, China also accounts for 67% of exports refined manganese and manganese products. Moreover, those large manganese deposits are at the bottom of the sea. This means that deep sea mining is playing an increasingly important role. And the deep sea mining of so-called manganese nodules also poses a risk to the environment and thus, of course, to flora and fauna in the sea. So the mining with, no, back to the, thank you. So mining with special manganese nodules collectors can stir up sediment clouds rich in fine particles, which significantly affects the more than 100,000 years old non-renewable living environment in the deep sea. So having talked about those four minerals, of course, a number of other raw materials are also required for the energy and mobility transition. Because, of course, these e-vehicles should be charged with mainly green energy. And to produce the green energy, a lot of more wind turbines or solar panels, for example, will be needed. And their production is also very minimal and mineral and metal intense. So we just have to keep that in mind as well. And also a lot of more copper is needed. And having said this, I will hand back to Johannes.
Thank you very much, Lisa. As we heard, in addition to the minerals that were just presented, there are a couple of other materials which play a major role in electric vehicles. And copper is a quite good example because copper is not a direct part of the battery itself, but copper is necessary for the electric engine, for the connection between the battery and the electronics, and finally for the charging infrastructure as well. And as Lisa mentioned, there are various minerals which are not only needed for the cars, cars itself, but also for the green energy technologies around it to power the cars. So solar panels, photovoltaics, wind turbines, and other sources are important components of a strategy to reduce the CO2 emissions. Next slide, please. On this chart, we can see the material intensity of copper in different types of vehicles. We see on the very left that on average, a conventional fossil fuel private car contains around 23 kilograms of copper, a battery-powered electric vehicle requires almost 6 times more copper than this fossil-fueled car. We can see that with 83 kilograms. Due to their size and weight, battery-powered electric buses on the very right, which are, for example, used in public transport, require around 370 kilograms of copper. That's a lot. Okay, next slide, please. Let's take a quick look at the role of China. In more or less all mineral value chains, China plays a crucial role. On one side, China itself has important strategic reserves of key rare earth minerals, but also graphite and others, we heard that. And on the other side, China has invested a lot in mining projects globally. So that is why China has influence or control over 70% of world's graphite production and over 60% of world's lithium and cobalt production. And we also heard that China sources around 90% of its cobalt from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is equivalent to 77 kilotons. This great dependence from one sourcing country, the DRC, is also very remarkable because China has invested a lot into the DRC to get a hold of a strategic resource, cobalt, which is still of strategic importance for the batteries. With the help of these strategic investments, China has a very strong position also in the lithium market. As with cobalt, China's strong position China is controlling the value chain from mining to battery production. Next slide, please. The major battery producers are all located in East Asia, so in Japan, South Korea, and China. In 2018, over 97% of the global e-vehicle battery demand was supplied by these 3 countries. In comparison, European companies had a share of only approximately 1%. And China, however, is the primary supplier of the processed minerals, which are then delivered to the battery factories in South Korea and Japan for the assembling process. Next slide, please. Let us now take a brief look at the opportunities and risks of mining. For many countries, natural resources are substantially contributing to government revenues. The income through taxes and duties can contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, on short SDGs. And the allocation of revenues from natural resources enables countries to spend their money in education, infrastructure, and other topics. The mining sector can strengthen economic production, industrialization, and development also through accompanying infrastructure projects. The sector also offers local producers to get involved into value chains, for example, by selling agricultural products to mining canteens. And in addition to that, mining enterprises and their suppliers can generate employment perspectives. Next slide, please. As Lisa has already outlined a bit, there are a couple of challenges associated with mining. But before we come to the details, we have to distinguish between legal and illegal mining. Usually, industrial large-scale mining is legal, as well as many smaller scale mining activities. But there are many informal and also illegal mining activities. The risks of mining are different depending on the type of mining and on the type of mineral. But due to the limited time we have today, we will have to generalize a bit, I'm sorry. Environmental damage is inevitable in mining. Mining means that you're extracting something from the ground and nature is influenced to a certain extent. There is also the danger of contamination of air, soil, and water, for example, by toxic wastewater that comes from mining processes. Mining is often associated with human rights violations, for example, when it comes to child labor, forced or unpaid labor. This is predominantly the case in the informal sector. But also in the formal sector, local people are confronted with losing their livelihoods through resettlements, for example. In some regions, mining is contributing to conflict financing. Some conflicts, for example, in Central Africa or South America, are financed by illegal mining activities that generate illicit financial flows. Women are less likely to benefit from positive effects of the natural resource sector, such as access to well-paid jobs, and women suffer more from the negative consequences of mining. Women also face the discrimination due to broader structural, social, or even cultural barriers. Next point is that the intransparent supply chains of the capital-intensive mining sector is very vulnerable to corruption. And finally, mining projects are often connected with high expectations in local communities. People expect to find well-paid jobs, better infrastructure and access to electricity and water in remote regions. And these expectations are often not met, and the profit of mining business doesn't stay in the region. Next slide, please. Another risk is the energy intensity of the mining sector. Up to 11% of the world's energy demand comes from the mining sector. And just to illustrate that figure, that in 2007, the mining sector had a carbon footprint like Spain. So that's really a lot. And this is primarily because mining, or many mining projects, are still relying on fossil energy. But there is a trend that more and more mining projects start to invest in renewable energy sources. The share is still under 10%, but growing. Prices for renewables are decreasing, and they become more and more attractive for mining companies. Next slide, please. The trend towards renewables in the mining sector was investigated in a study by our X4D program at GIZ. This study gives you recommendations to governments, private companies, and energy suppliers on how to introduce renewables in the mining sector. On the right side, you can see that the Climate Smart Mining Initiative. The initiative was kicked off by GIZ support and works on several areas around climate sensible mining. For example, the initiative published a report on the influence of mining on forests and mitigation mechanisms. Next slide, please. So before we come to our last slide, let us take a brief look at some international standards and initiatives which are working towards responsible supply chains in the mining sector. For example, we can see on the left side in the middle the extractive industries transparency initiatives, which is a global multi-stakeholder standard which promotes the open and accountable management of extractive resources by making financial flows and project details available to the public. I was mentioning the corruption risk at one of the major risks in the mining business. So this standard or initiative is addressing specifically this challenge. On the right side in the middle, you can see the CONNEX initiative. CONNEX supports governments in negotiating better deals. Through fair and stable contracts, mining investments can mobilize revenues which individual countries need to achieve their SDGs. Lastly, I want to mention on the bottom left the Global Battery Alliance. The GBA is a multi-stakeholder initiative which is dealing with the question on how to design responsible supply chains for batteries in e-vehicles. A very complex endeavor, as we will see, or as we are seeing now. Next slide, please. Before we conclude, let me go into some trends which can be expected in the coming years. We have seen at the very beginning that the increase of and the demand of battery minerals is enormous in the coming years, but we will also see an advance in the development of new technologies for recycling and the introduction of a circular economy. You can see that on the right side, circular economy model for the mining sector. So on the left side, let's go back to the left side, sorry. Currently 90% of the cobalt and nickel and 50% of the lithium can be recycled or is recycled by current technologies, but new technologies will allow for higher shares in the future. These new recycling technologies need to be accompanied by legislations, however, to facilitate the recycling processes. Collection of used batteries needs to be improved, maybe through a deposit system. Policymakers need to address the still costly recycling process. And lastly, the users need to have more awareness of the challenges which are associated with the minerals in their e-vehicles. We also see alternative power technologies rising, like the hydrogen-powered vehicles, for example. And in this case, the challenges of achieving responsible supply chains are shifting to other minerals, however. Okay, in case you have any questions, we will be happy to answer them during the Q&A round later. But now I hand back over to Lena.
Thank you very much, Johannes. And thanks for giving us this very interesting insight into what materials are actually used in batteries, to what extent, where do they come from, and what is the future outlook on possibly reusing materials if we manage to get the right recycling and circular economy measures in place. I think this is a very good point to go to our case study, Cobalt from the Congo, which our colleague Philipp Schütte will look further into. And I think you really have an expert who's seen the situation on the ground. So do not hold back with your questions, and please let him know what you're most interested in the situation in Congo.
Yeah, hello everyone. I hope everyone can hear me all right. Thanks to GIZ for hosting this webinar. As was explained, I'm going to give you a short overview on our work in the DRC. Next slide, please. So before I get into the specifics of our project, I just want to give a brief overview on what BGR is doing. So BGR is the Federal Institute for Geosciences and Natural Resources. Essentially, we're an advisor to the German federal government, to industry and the broader society. And we also engage in research activities. And lastly, we provide some technical expertise on the international development cooperation projects that we are implementing. So I'm working with a mining and sustainability unit. We have a team where 50% is based out of Hanover and 50% is based in international projects. In the DRC, for instance, we have 5 persons working on our project there. And our research activities generally concern a broad range of sustainability issues. For instance, we're looking at the social and ecological criticality of minerals. We're looking at water management in mining. We're looking at reclamation of former mines. We're looking at ore deposits and tailings. We're looking at mineral certification and mineral supply chains. And so we also do development cooperation, and in the DRC, we have had a project ongoing since 2009, which is called Strengthening of Control in the DRC Mining Sector. And what I'm going to show you now, that's based on the experience from that project. So you see 3 bullet points here. This is what I want to talk about in this presentation. First of all, why is it important that we think about cobalt in the DRC when we talk in general about electric vehicles and batteries? And then second, what are the specific challenges that we have in the copper and cobalt sector in the DRC? And finally, I'm going to illustrate some recommendations on the way forward. And of course, as was said before, one of the major issues that you have in the DRC is that you have this juxtaposition of large-scale industrial mining on the one side and artisanal and small-scale mining on the other side. And I'm going to illustrate that on the next few slides. What you see here on the left is the relative proportion of the DRC in terms of global cobalt supply. So essentially, you can see that over the last 60 years, the DRC has almost always contributed more than 60% to the world supply, except for a short period in the 90s, which was due to some internal conflict and turmoil in the eastern DRC. And more importantly, what you see on the right, this is not in relative, but in absolute terms now. And you see that we have had an explosion of global cobalt demand over the last 10 years. And essentially, it has been the DRC which has been able to step up and really supply a lot of cobalt to the world market at a scale that has never been seen before. And when we talk about the future cobalt supply, we are probably going to increase it further. And the DRC, due to the geology, it's a critical country in order to make that possible, in order to satisfy the global cobalt demand. Next slide, please. Where are we in the DRC? Essentially, when we talk about cobalt and copper, we're talking about the so-called copper belt, which is the world's largest province of copper and cobalt deposits. It's located in the very southeasternmost portion of the DRC, and it's got a very geologically and economically attractive association of high copper and cobalt grades, which makes these deposits very, very competitive compared to other countries. And so when you look at the map, you see that the copper belt, it spans an area of several hundred kilometers. And across all this area in the DRC, as well as in Zambia, you find dozens of very huge world-class mines. What you see on the right in this pie chart, that's the distribution of globally reported reserves and resources of cobalt that are available at the short to midterm. And you see that the DRC, it's hosting more of half of the world's resources and reserves. So it's going to be an important producer in the future as well. So as I've said, the DRC has been the world's most important source of cobalt over the past 50 or 60 years. And this situation is not likely to change in the near to midterm, at least. Now, it's important to reflect on what that means for the global battery market. So we expect that the global battery market is to grow further. And cobalt is going to be substituted out of batteries due to cost and other effects. However, because the global market as a whole is growing, we are still going to need more cobalt than we are using today. So that means we still are going to rely on cobalt, which to a huge part is going to be sourced in the DRC. And now in the DRC, you do have several sustainability challenges that I'm going to show you on the next few slides. And it's important really to note that the global battery market as a whole cannot really afford to exclude cobalt from the DRC from their supply chains. You might have a situation where individual companies decide, I would rather source my cobalt from from Australia or from Russia or from Finland or Sweden. But the majority of the global cobalt is always going to be sourced from the DRC. And because it's such a huge proportion, all these sustainability issues in the DRC are going to reflect on the EV market as a whole. So a lot of the challenges in the DRC are related to artisanal and small scale mining, or ASM. What you can see in this diagram in red, that's a proportion of ASM cobalt production in the DRC. You see that's fluctuating over the past 10 years, largely in response to changes in the international cobalt price. So as the cobalt price goes up, artisanal mining becomes more attractive, and when the cobalt price goes down, then those ASM operations are scaled back. But in general, you always have a share of 10 to 25% of ASM production coming out of the DRC. Now, it's very, very important to talk about artisanal cobalt mining because it's an essential livelihood base for 100 to 150,000 miners, plus their families and local business. So in total, perhaps it's supporting 1 million people directly or indirectly. What you have in cobalt are risks of child labor, presence of security services on the mines which are not supposed to be there. You have corruption risks, and you have traceability problems. What you don't have is that you have conflict, like what you might have heard about coltan or gold or tin, where you have so-called conflict minerals. That's not an issue right now for cobalt. You have additional sustainability problems beyond supply chain due diligence risks. Those are, for instance, health and safety risks, lack of reclamation of former mines, and you also create social conflicts. And as my colleagues have explained in former presentations, most of ASM activities in the DRC are actually illegal. So you do have a small proportion of mines that are legal, and the framework is there to make more mines legal, but to get it there, that's very, very difficult. And right now, probably more than 90% is of questionable sources. Next slide, please. So the fact that you have so much illegal ASM production of cobalt in the DRC, that's not directly a responsibility of just the ASM sector, but you also have to look at the large-scale industrial mining sector. So what you can see on this map is essentially the whole copper belt, where you find all the copper and cobalt mines, and everywhere where you see these bluish squares or where you see gray squares, those are industrial mining concessions for mining or for exploration. So you see that basically the whole land is already covered by these concessions. Some people might call that land grabbing. And so artisanal cobalt miners, they pretty much don't have a choice. They are forced to work on these concessions because they are almost everywhere. And so a lot of this work is illegal. What you can also see is that there are a few green rectangles on that map. Those are the areas where you can do legal ASM, but you can see there's only very few of those areas. And most of the ASM, which is represented by the red dots on this map, that's taking place on the industrial concessions. And that's reflecting that those industrial concessions are far more attractive in terms of ore grades and also in terms of logistical access. Next slide, please. This is just an illustration of some typical ASM supply chains. What you see on the upper row is an illustration of the extraction. So you typically dig shafts which are 10 to 20 meters deep, sometimes more, and then you take the ore out as concentrate, and then you're going to sell it in the DRC to middlemen. What you see on the lower left, that's an example of a cobalt depot where you used to have hundreds of these kind of trading stations where artisanal miners would sell cobalt that had been mined illegally. Recently, the DRC government closed down most of these cobalt trading depots, and you can only find some trading shops in few official centers and on some mining concessions as well, where they are run by industrial producers. But still, there is a lot of illegal production ongoing. And so you have to ask the question, where is that material going? Because right now, the transparency of that is not very good. You essentially lose track of these artisanal cobalt concentrates, and eventually what you get out of the DRC, that's what you see on the lower right, that's this green powder, that's cobalt hydroxide. So it's been transformed, but you don't know exactly where and when the artisanal minerals have entered the supply chain. Next slide, please. So importantly, when we talk about artisanal miners in the DRC, that's usually Congolese nationals. But when you look at the intermediate traders that buy the ore from the artisanal miners and then sell it on to cobalt processors, those are actually the persons in the supply chain that make most of the money out of the sector. And so when you look at this is a pie chart based on BGR research last year. It shows you that most of the traders operating in buying and selling ASM material in the DRC, they're actually not Congolese. About a quarter of them are Congolese nationals, and most of them are Chinese, and a quarter of them are also either Lebanese or Indian traders. So it's these foreigners who make a lot of money out of the artisanal cobalt sector in the DRC. When we talk about large-scale mining, we have to be very clear that the DRC economy is totally relying on large-scale mining of copper and cobalt ore, as well as other ores like gold or tin recently. But copper and cobalt is a very, very important ingredient in that. So it's a major contributor of taxes and export revenues in the DRC. It is providing significant foreign direct investment, despite the DRC being a very challenging investment climate, and it's providing a lot of infrastructure and high-scale jobs for the Congolese population. But when we talk about industrial mining, it's not it's not fair if you would say I'm just sourcing my cobalt from industrial mines in the DRC, and that's why I don't have any problems. Because, for instance, you do have a lot of historical liabilities related to contamination from copper processing, which are related to these copper and cobalt mines. You have widespread corruption risks. you also have what I showed on this map. You have these concerns that the concessions, the industrial concessions, are everywhere, and they don't leave much legal room for ASM activities. You do have the situation that industrial miners are employing security forces, and sometimes they are confronting ASM, and then you have to ask the question whether those security forces are actually respecting human rights. And then finally, you have a lack of transparency. So there's a lot of ASM material produced, and the material is going somewhere, and the question is where. Next slide, please. Those are just some key observations from a BRG mapping campaign that we did last year. So we mapped about 100 copper and cobalt mines, ASM mines last year, which represents about half of the total cobalt sector. So in general, when you hear about observations on cobalt in the DRC, it's always important to ask the question whether this information is actually representative of the whole sector or whether it's just some small isolated spot. So what we observed is that the working conditions are very unsafe. It's also exacerbated by the fact that the mines are usually located very close to the villages. So there are health risks not only for the miners, but also for the local population. We have ASM cooperatives there, but those cooperatives rarely provide safety services and protective equipment to the artisanal miners, but they mainly act as buyers and sellers of minerals. Child labor has been an important discussion over the last 8 years or so in the cobalt sector. And in our mapping campaign, we observed that there were children present on about 1/3 of all mines. We estimated on those mines where we got data from, there were about 2,500 kids working. And importantly, the majority of them was less than 10 years of age. So we have a lot of very young, vulnerable children active on those sites. However, it's also important to be clear about what they are doing. So when we talk about the definition of worst forms of child labor, according to the ILO, we are talking about activities that really damage the health or the moral or the well-being of children. So we do not observe a lot of this kind of worst forms of child labor on the mines that we have visited. It does occur, but it's fortunately a minority. What we see is that a lot of children are on the mines and they are not attending schools. And so you might argue that this is a very bad thing, but you also have to see that all those artisanal miners are very, very poor families, and they often cannot afford the school fees. And if you look at children engaging in mining, sometimes it's to support family income, and it's actually allowing children afterwards to visit school for some months. So when we talk about artisanal miners, you also have to talk about the poverty which is driving the artisanal mining sector. Next slide, please. Some recommendations on the way forward, very briefly. A critical thing is we see international companies asking questions about the situation in the cobalt sector and trying to improve the situation, but it's very, very important that we also have ownership and input from the DRC government. So we cannot really address this situation and change a sector with hundreds of thousands of artisanal miners without the government playing a very strong role in this process of improving the situation. But international companies can play a very strong supporting role, setting up supply chain standards, doing audit work and so on, and also supporting pilot projects. Some technical recommendations from our side are that there should be a better designation and management of ASM areas where legal ASM is possible, and we also should improve the capacity of cooperatives to better manage the ASM sector. Next slide, please. So one advantage that we have when we talk about the cobalt sector is that we can build on the experience that we have had over the past 10 years on the so-called conflict minerals like tantalum or tin or gold. We have developed the OECD due diligence guidance, which shows that it's possible to be applied in artisanal supply chains. It's a progressive approach that takes a long time, and it requires good faith efforts, but it's certainly better to engage in a discussion how to improve artisanal mineral sourcing rather than deciding I'm going to disengage and I'm not going to buy any artisanal minerals at all, because that way you're not going to solve the problem. You're just leaving the field to stakeholders that might be less interested in transparency. And I'm just not going to go into the details there due to time constraints, but in general, I just want to say that there are a lot of different approaches like certification and traceability available, and we should try to encourage knowledge sharing from pilot projects that are operating on some mines and try to upscale these experiences and make them available to the broader sector as a whole. And I think that's the end of the presentation. I encourage you to visit our website, which where I've posted the links up there, and you can find a lot more studies and information there. Thank you.
Many thanks, Philip. I think this was a very good addition to the first presentation, and me personally, at least, it made me wonder about, well, what measures are in place already? What are, pilot projects that you mentioned that had a very good effect, and what are best practices that are on the ground? But I'm sure my colleague Marvin has captured even more questions from the participants. Of course, you're still free to post more questions directly to us or in the open chat, and we'll make sure to address as many as possible now.
Thank you very much, Lena. Hi, everyone. My name is Marvin, as Lena said, and I'm a colleague at GIZ as well, and I'll be taking over now to moderate the Q&A session. And our plan is to use the next 15 minutes or so to give you the space to ask your burning questions regarding the presentations we just heard. Thank you again from my side to Lisa and Johannes and also Philip. And I would say, let's do a quick round of questions and answers. I've prepared a list here. Thank you very much for all your activities. We received a lot of questions privately and also publicly posted questions. And I'm starting with the first one from Ana Zornik from Curitiba, Brazil. She likes to know if there's any kind of research to produce batteries with renewable materials and sources. Maybe Johannes, you'd like to start on that since you mentioned the topic as well, slightly.
Yes, I can do that. I would recommend that we can send some studies, or there are studies, but it's still very difficult to follow up the whole supply chain. As Philip mentioned, the ore is at some point mixed and comes together from industrial mining and ASM mining, so it's very difficult for just one mineral to get a responsible supply chain. But I can send some links around to studies that take up this question.
Okay, thank you. So let's move on to the next question, or actually it's a question separated into two questions. So to any speaker, so please feel free to answer this question. First, is cobalt as a byproduct of nickel and copper mining capable to reduce significantly the share of DRC in the world's cobalt market? And secondly, what are the trends regarding lithium-ion batteries without cobalt? For example, lithium iron phosphorate batteries, and can they change the current EV battery supply chain? Very interesting question here.
Yeah, maybe I can speak to the first question at least. So when you talk about nickel and cobalt deposits globally, they are being mined increasingly, but they're not going to be able to completely replace the supply that you find in the DRC. We're talking about 100,000 tons of cobalt supply and growing potentially to 200,000 tons in a few years. And what you find in other countries, for instance, in Australia, where you are producing nickel and copper together with cobalt, you produce 5,000 tons a year. And perhaps if you upscale that, if you double it, which would be good, then you can produce 10,000 tons a year, but you are still far from 200,000 tons a year production, which is a future market requirement. So it's very, very unlikely to replace cobalt from the DRC with other sources, unless you would be willing to pay much higher prices for it. And that's often not really the interest of the companies in the battery supply chain.
Thank you very much, Philip. So another question going into a different direction. What policies or best practices are there in the resource-rich countries to ensure more sustainability in sourcing and delivery chains?
I mean, just maybe one comment on this, on the second question before.
Of course, yes, please.
I think there's a clear trend among car producers to introduce cobalt-free batteries, but apart from this interest of the industry, due to the bad reputation of cobalt, cobalt batteries are still among the most energy in effective technologies so far. But this will change. I mean, some car producers have experiments with cobalt-free batteries, but I think this will still take a few years until cobalt-free batteries will become the standard.
I see. Thank you very much. So not the greatest prospects to minimize the cobalt to zero, but there's, I think, a lot of research going on into that direction as well. So maybe coming back to the third question. So what are governments, or how can governments integrate best practice approaches in the resource-rich countries to ensure more sustainability in the sourcing chain and the delivery chains? Are there any best practices you can tell us about?
Well, I can mention a few if you want. So there are some, we have to differentiate, of course, industrial large-scale mining and artisanal and small-scale mining. So when we talk about industrial mining, there are international mining organizations such as ICMM, the International Council on Minerals and Metals, and others that where a lot of the large-scale miners are members, and they are sort of self-regulating. So even though you do have, of course, government inspections on those large-scale mines, and you do have regulations, and the mines have to comply with all those regulations, there are also kind of independent industry standards that are put in place on large-scale mines, on many of them, not on all of them. And so I would say that the sustainability, there's a broad sustainability framework in place for orientation when you talk about large-scale mining. When you talk about the government responsibility, then it's more about transparency on the revenues from the mining. So a colleague mentioned, for instance, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, which should make sure that the income from mining is not going into the pockets of some politicians, but rather it's going to be in the state budget, and then it's going to be used for the benefit of the population. And when you talk about the DRC, or when you talk about other resource-rich countries, you might have heard about the resource curse. That's a key part: transparency in the revenues and the fair payments. And when you talk about artisanal and small-scale mining, very briefly, there are certification programs out there which are often overseen by both the government and the industry and civil society. So I think it's very important when you talk about the ASM sector that you really have these multi-stakeholder discussions, and you don't just listen to the government or to the industry, but you combine them and civil society, and you find a way to formulate standards and work together in order to agree on what should be a responsible supply chain.
Thank you very much, Philip. So I'm looking at the list of questions coming through right now. Maybe a question from Sergio Ruiz. Is there some experiences or good practices on circular economy in the nickel sector? So very concrete. Any expert thought on that?
Way too specific for me. We talk that through tomorrow, Sergio.
Okay, so a follow up on that bilaterally. Also another question: how to handle batteries that have lost their useful lives, and what is the use of second life batteries? This would go a bit more into the recycling and after use direction, but yeah, maybe we can quickly cover that as well.
Yeah, very interesting questions. I mean, there are a couple of companies which are in the recycling process in Europe. One of the biggest is Umicore, that probably I've heard of. They have implemented recycling processes, but there's still a lot to improve. I mean, the recycling quotas are 60% with lithium, or 50%, sorry. And for nickel and cobalt, it's over 90%. It's still quite a lot. But also for the other materials, graphite, manganese, and so on, there's still a lot of room for improvement. And what is maybe important is that the battery demand, or the demand for battery minerals, is about to rise a lot, as we have seen, until a certain point. And this some studies cover that break-even point, so to say, that in 2050, depending on the scenario, there's more or less enough battery minerals in the market that can be recycled, also due to better technologies, that the amount of newly sourced mining processes is going to decrease at that point. So that's maybe some interesting aspect.
Thank you very much, Johannes. So maybe coming to the last question before we wrap it up. Philip mentioned recycling potential towards 90% of cobalt. This seems very high, but also encouraging. How far away in years would that be, Philip?
Actually, I think that that was mentioned in the first presentation by Johannes or by Lisa.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Johannes, do you have a prospect how the trend is going to develop in terms of recycling of cobalt?
That one, I think we better deliver that with the wrap-up mail, or together with the study I promised.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for all the activities and the interesting questions. I see a lot of questions going into the direction of batteries, containments, and also future battery designs. So this could be a topic we will talk about in the next webinar. And I think for me, now it's time to wrap it up and hand over to Lena again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marvin. All right, in order to stick with time, I'd like to thank again all of our expert speakers for joining this webinar, for being available to the questions, and thank you everyone for paying such close attention and raising these great questions. We'll definitely follow up on all the open questions. Sorry if yours wasn't raised in the webinar. Small last reminder, please do use the survey we have at the end of the webinar, because it's going to help us improve on aspects that you feel were too little addressed or should be addressed in the future. And otherwise, we hope you stay tuned for the next TUMIVolt Charging Station webinar. And we look forward to seeing all of you soon. Bye-bye.